All right, well, thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Dr. Kate DeConnick. I teach in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego, if we haven't met before. Along with Dr. Mike Williams, who's also with us today, I'm the co-director of the Urgent Challenges Collective. So the Collective is an initiative at USD that supports research and teaching and advocacy / community engagement to address homelessness here in San Diego. So today's event that you are all attending is the first in a series of events that we're co-hosting this fall with the San Diego River Park Foundation. And we're very excited for this conversation and the discussion to follow with all of you. Just a couple things to get us started for today. First, a disclaimer and a reminder that in an hour-long session, we are probably not going to be able to answer all of your questions or do a fully comprehensive review of our topic for today, which is the intersections of homelessness and environmentalism. We'll get as far as we can, but there are also many, many wonderful resources that are available on the Urgent Challenges Collective's website. So if you are interested in learning more, then we would love to have you check out those resources moving forward. Okay. Before turning the Zoom mic over to Dr. Williams, who's going to introduce our speaker for today, just a couple of quick things that I want to share about Zoom functionality for today. First of all, we're going to have a pretty big group in attendance for today. So as is the case with most Zoom events that you've probably been to, we would appreciate it if you could keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking at some point during the conversation and the Q&A. Okay. So background noise, we're going to cut that down. Additionally, during the first part of our talk, our speaker is going to share some slides and she's going to talk through some material with us. During just that portion of the presentation for today, if you're able to keep your cameras off, we would appreciate it. That will just prevent the video from lagging. If we have too many cameras on, it gets a little bit harder for the system to keep up. But once we get into the Q&A session, if you would like to turn on your camera so that our speaker can see your beautiful faces and connect with you more directly, we would love that. We obviously will not require it, but we would love it if you're able to do that. And after Sarah has finished her presentation, we will have time for questions and answers. So the way that we typically moderate Q&A at our events for the Urgent Challenges Collective via Zoom is we create a shared Google Doc, which I'm going to drop for you in the chat in just a second. And you are welcome to go into that document and add in any questions that kind of come to you throughout the course of the presentation, or just more general questions that you might have that you'd be interested in having us talk about during the Q&A. So we will build up a collective list of questions that we'll use as the basis for the Q&A session. The nice thing about the Google Doc is also if somebody else types in a question that you think is really interesting or that you would love to hear more about, you can put a little asterisk next to it and we'll know that more than one person is interested. So that will kind of like boost up that question, higher in the ranks. So I will drop that in just a second in the chat. I'm also going to enable the live transcription. So for the purpose of accessibility, if you want to enable the live transcription feature on your side of things, you'll be able to see the rough transcript at the bottom of the screen for today's event. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put that link for the Q&A document, which also has some great resources at the bottom related to our topic for today. So please open up the document, whether or not you have a question. And I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Williams now, who's going to introduce our speaker. So thank you again for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. DeConnick. And as she mentioned, we are thrilled that we have this partnership with the San Diego River Park Foundation this semester. And it came through the power of an email that Sarah reached out to us with an email in June, and we started conversations about what we could maybe collaborate together. And this is one of the initiatives that came out of it. So we're just thrilled this is happening, and we're thrilled that Sarah is here with us. So before I turn the floor over to Sarah, I just want to introduce Sarah Hutmacher is the Chief Associate Director at the San Diego River Park Foundation, where she's been in that position for about 6 years, I think. She is a graduate of UCSD, just up the road from us, where she studied environmental systems. And she's going to be sharing with us today, not only the good work that the San Diego River Park Foundation is doing, but specifically the work they're doing that intersects with homelessness. So Sarah, we're thrilled to have you here on Zoom. Thank you so much for making the time and welcome.
Thank you so much for the welcome. I appreciate that. And we're excited to have a chance to talk to all of you guys. The River Park Foundation is a nonprofit organization. We've been doing work focused on the health of the San Diego River since we were founded in 2001. And in that time, working with community members, especially students, has been a really important part of our mission. And so we're excited to have this opportunity to, one, share a little bit about what we do, and potentially talk about ways that students from USD can get involved in what we do and help us kind of build the program into what our hopes and dreams are for it. So thanks again for having me. I appreciate it. So I'm going to throw up some slides. Okay, I'm going to go into presentation. Okay, are we seeing my presentation now? Okay, great. So the thing we want to talk about today is sort of the intersection between homelessness and trash in the San Diego River. So the River Park Foundation, as you might imagine from just our name, is really focused on some of the environmental issues that affect the San Diego River and its health. Although over the years, we've become increasingly engaged in other sectors, and it's become increasingly visible that this is a super intersectional issue to be able to figure out how to solve the issues related to the health of the San Diego River, while at the same time having an eye on other improvements in our whole region. So what I'm going to do a little bit today is talk about sort of the history of the program, where we started, and then move into where we are today. So the River Park Foundation, as I said, is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We work on a range of different problems. Today, I'm going to be talking primarily about our trash-free river efforts, but we also have youth education programs. We do land acquisition. We work on a lot of stewardship and conservation programs. We do research projects on animals in the wild, in the upper part of the watershed. So no matter what your interest area is, I definitely encourage you to check out some of our upcoming events. But today I'm going to talk a lot about trash and how that affects particularly the lower river. So the San Diego River is 52 miles long. It has a 440 square mile watershed that's located entirely within San Diego County. So it flows up from near Julian and Santa Isabel, if you've ever been in that part of the San Diego mountains, down through mostly Cleveland National Forest, mostly public lands, into El Capitan Reservoir. There's a dam on the San Diego River at El Capitan Reservoir. And then that's sort of the dividing line in our minds between the upper river and the lower river. So the lower river includes El Monte Valley, Lakeside, Santee, Mission Trails, Mission Valley, and then out to the ocean at Dog Beach in Ocean Beach. So just flowing right under the USD campus down in the valley. And if you guys want, this map is available on our website. I have the link here, and I'm happy to share these slides if it makes it easier for people to get links after the fact. So the river includes the lower river, some really beautiful sections like this. This is out in Santee. There's some really pretty habitat areas. There's recreational trails along both sides of the river in some of the sections, including this one. There's also some just beautiful canopy that goes over water. Some of this water is year round, which is really important for wildlife. But we've also got areas where you can start to see the human impact closing in on the river. So this is at the river mouth in Ocean Beach. Actually, you might be able to just see USD in this picture, kind of in the distance. In 2000, 34 million gallons of untreated sewage flowed into the San Diego River from a spill that originated in Alvarado Creek near San Diego State. And that was the largest sewer spill in California history at that time. I think it still is. And it ran for a week, which is how it got to be such a significant spill. And hardly anybody noticed. And a big reason that people didn't notice is because at that time, the river primarily ran behind loading docks and behind fences. And a lot of people just really weren't spending a lot of time in the river. The people who were people like our CEO and some of the founders of the organization who noticed literal untreated sewage in the river and said, hey, you know, something's going on. And it just took a while to find it. I always kind of joke that this is the slide where I was looking for a screenshot of, you know, the newspaper headline to put in here, and wasn't in the paper, wasn't a thing that really made it onto the radar of very many people. So the River Park Foundation said, this kind of neglect is not something that makes sense for the San Diego River. It goes through so many communities. It has potential to serve recreational value and nature access value for 500,000 people. We want to make sure that the river has the attention and the stewardship that it needs just to be healthy and to serve all of those functions. So in 2000, sorry, I'm going to go back to this slide. In 2001, we became a nonprofit. So we worked to start a whole bunch of programs. And one of the first programs we started was our trash program. At that time, a lot of people, when they thought of the river, this is what they thought of. So, you know, floating trash, stormwater debris. They thought of encampments was a huge thing that people told us, was that the river was basically directly associated with, I wouldn't go there because it's full of homeless encampments and I don't feel safe. So we wanted to start by quantifying that issue. So this is kind of what I'm going to talk about for the most part. It took us a few years to kind of develop, how are we going to tackle this? And we wanted to make sure that it was clear to people what the scale of the issue was. So, you know, I know this isn't exactly a Q&A, but I bet most of you guys have probably been to a beach cleanup, or you've been to some sort of cleanup before where you pick up trash in a bucket and, you know, you make a big difference by removing a lot of litter and cigarette butts. That's awesome. But a lot of the trash that we're talking about in the San Diego River is on the scale of 1 million pounds of trash per year. So it's an enormous quantity of trash to try to get your arms around. And so when we started to do this data collection, we said, all right, we are going to address the source of this trash, but also we need to figure out how we can, we're going to address the symptom is what I mean. And we also want to address the source. So we started doing a lot of data collection to inform how do we go about solving this problem? And also, how do we make sure that we send the right tools for the job? So when we plan cleanups, we send volunteers that have the right skills for the trash that we're talking about. We know, are we trying to target like 1 truckload of trash, or do we need a 40-yard dumpster for disposal? Do those volunteers need a shovel or a boat hook or a net? You know, what kind of things do they need to be successful? So initially, our entire trash or data collection program was built around informing, making sure we had really effective and efficient use of resources for cleanups. But over time, we started to see this trend. So what I'm going to point out, sorry, I'm going to close my window. What I'm going to point out on this table is that I'm sure you all see this giant spike in 2016 and a big spike still in 2017. So in 2016, the San Diego hosted the All-Star Game downtown. And when the changes in enforcement happened around encampments downtown, we saw a giant spike in the number of encampments in the riverbed. And similarly, in 2017, when there was a hepatitis A outbreak in San Diego that changed sanitation and enforcement in the riverbed, we saw a big spike in encampments in the riverbed. So what we were seeing was this, I'm sure not a surprise to anybody who thinks about it for 5 seconds, is that when you clamp down on an area, if that clamp is enforcement, then you're mostly pushing people to a different area. And what we were seeing is that they were going to the river. And in the riverbed at that time, there were very, very, very few people doing any sort of outreach or services in the riverbed to try to help the folks that are living in there get connected with, you know, getting their driver's license or their ID replaced, or getting any access to medical care or any of those kind of things, food, you know. So the riverbed is, for many reasons, which I'll get into in a second, is not a great place for people to be living because of some of the safety and access issues, but also they're just, all of the services that existed in the city, I shouldn't say that, many of the services that existed in the city were really geared toward people experiencing homelessness in an urban setting. So in these naturalized settings, people were kind of getting off the grid and off the radar of a lot of those agencies. So we said, all right, now's the time. We need to get involved and make sure that this is something that people are noticing, and see if there's a way for us to help. So I will say that this data is from our annual snapshot, which we do in October coming up. And the snapshot that we do is what does the river look like at that weekend? So you'll see that even this peak is 184,000 pounds. And you heard me say that we track about 1 million pounds a year. That's just because there's trash coming in and out of the riverbed all the time. So at that moment of the year, there's about 184,000 pounds. Most recently, it was more like 150 or 130. I think right now it's about 155, but that number is kind of always changing. And when we have cleanups or new encampments or new storms that introduce stormwater debris and all those different things, it's constantly changing. So I wanted to make sure to explain the difference between the point in time and the cumulative. The River Park Foundation does survey the many parts of the lower river. So we currently survey from Santee to the ocean, with the exception of Mission Trails Regional Park. Mission Trails Regional Park is pretty well surveyed by the rangers and users because it's such a developed park. But the other sections are all areas that we cover. So it's about 19, I believe, miles of the San Diego River, and a couple of tributaries that you can see, Forester Creek in green and Chaparral Canyon in blue. So why does there need to be a river park? A lot of people, especially, I mean, a lot of the students, you probably come from other parts of the state or the country or the world, where a lot of times rivers have one owner and they're managed by one municipality, for example, or one nonprofit, something like that, land manager. In the San Diego River, there's about 1,300 acres of riverbed, but there are more than 30 different landowners. And that includes public agencies like the City of San Diego, City of Santee, County of San Diego, but it also includes Caltrans and the Transit Authority, the USPS. So we have some federal government owned land in the property, the Department of Fish and Wildlife. All these different agencies have different rules, different enforcement, different regulatory environments, different amounts of resources, and all of those different things that really can affect how successful they're able to be with managing their property. And this certainly applies to trash management, but as we get into the talk about how it relates to homeless encampments, it also really impacts how they handle encampments, both from how they're regulated as well as just how what their attitude is toward encampments on the property. So one of the biggest roles that the River Park Foundation plays is managing all of those different entities and attempting to coordinate efforts as much as possible so that we can avoid that issue I talked about before, where you clamp down in one area and think it impacts what's happening upstream or downstream of the river. And then of course, there's different regulatory entities depending on, who is the authority in those different land ownership. So our model we call it a data-informed impact model. We work to collect all of this data when we're in the field. So we have a smartphone app that our volunteers use, and they go out to survey the riverbed multiple days a week to collect this data. That data goes from the app onto our web portal. There's a screenshot of that showing here, as well as a link if you ever want to check it out on your own. This portal is open to the public, but we do have a password wall that hides certain information about active encampments. But all of this data then is something that we can do landowner by landowner reporting and communications about here's the circumstances of what's going on this particular property or in this particular jurisdiction. We can say, okay, this area is ready for a cleanup and we think we need X number of volunteers and X number of dumpsters and X number of shovels and trash bags and all that kind of thing. Or we can advise a private landowner, like, we think you should do this cleanup, here's what we recommend. And then we just keep doing that over and over again. So from a trash management side, this tool is really about understanding how to handle the trash. But let's see, I think I have one more slide about that, then I'll get into the encampment side. Yeah, so as you can see though, when we do this data collection, our volunteers and staff have extensive knowledge of the riverbed. Almost every part of the riverbed is an area where we know how to access it. We know where the paths are. We know where the frequent hotspots for trash and encampments are. We know who the landowners are, what kind of permissions we need, sometimes what kind of permits we need to access the property. In addition, we have these really robust relationships with the stakeholders so that they know they can ask us questions, we can ask them questions. We have a big document we call the brain that helps us understand like who's in charge of what. But importantly for this intersectional issue, we also have a multi-year data set of all of the locations of encampments in the riverbed, how much trash is associated with those encampments, how frequently they reoccur. And all of that information we're one of the only places in the state where there's a data set like that kind of intersects trash and encampments. And because we're in the riverbed so often, and we never clean up active encampments, so we end up talking a lot to people. If there happens to be an encampment in an area where we are working, we might say, hey, is there anything you'd like us to get rid of? Or where should we stay, make sure we stay clear of anything that is of value to people. We have a lot of relationships and sort of informal familiarity with the people that are living in the riverbed. And because of that, we have a little bit of knowledge of maybe their background or their family, or they may trust us a little bit because we help them with water bottles and snacks and trash bags and things like that. So we have a little bit of trust and relationship already. And I think for us, that really just says like, this is an incredible opportunity for us to take that, our ecological knowledge and our relationship with the folks that are living in the riverbed, and marry it with somebody who actually has the training and resources to address those issues. So for about 5 years, I met with all sorts of different agencies to say, hey, what would it take for you to do outreach in the riverbed? And most of the time what I heard, and I'm sure this isn't going to be news to any of you guys that are familiar with this industry, is that the homeless outreach organizations have such limited resources to have impact. And what they're trying to do is reach the largest number of people possible to help the largest number of people possible in the biggest impact they can. And for them, wandering around in the riverbed to try to find people is not always a good use of their resources. And we said, we can help with that because we know the riverbed really well. We know where the encampments are. We can make sure that when you go out there, we will literally walk you to somebody's front door and help make sure that you use all of your time on client management and service delivery, as opposed to just navigating and wandering around. So this is the intersectional issue, right? There's the environment. So all of the lands that we do survey on are considered environmentally sensitive lands. That means that they're close, they have proximity to water, they have habitat that is increasingly limited in our region, and they have the potential to transport trash and negative impact onto state waters. We, as I said, have an estimated about 1 million pounds of trash enters the riverbed every year. So the scale of this issue is significant from an environmental standpoint. And we have the data to show that about in a given year, it varies year to year, but in recent years, our data shows that between 74 and 95% of the trash that we identify in our surveys is associated with encampments. So it helps to prioritize that as an issue. Trash negatively affects the environment. I mean, this is not news to any of you guys, I'm sure, but it has water quality impacts, definitely air quality impacts. It has harm to wildlife. This photo is actually one I took recently of a bird standing on a little trash island in the estuary. It certainly has aesthetic impacts. We would love for people to love and recreate on the river. And, if you're looking down in the river and it's full of garbage, it's a lot harder to, feel connected to that environment as like a positive relationship between people and the environment. And then obviously trash in near waterways is a lot more likely to transport into other habitats and ecosystems, like marine ecosystems, especially that are potentially very vulnerable to trash. And then, this photograph is an example of when you have people living in areas that are where they're cooking or doing other, normal life activities to make their food. It's very dangerous to do that in the summer in San Diego when it's super dry, and all of this vegetation can go up in flames very quickly. We see hundreds of fires in the riverbed, usually small, but still, I'm sure very scary if they're happening right outside your front door, if you're living in the riverbed. Also, if we don't pick it up in time, this is what happens. So this is an area where the regulators have had a lot of difficulty getting the cleanup to happen. So over time, the trees defoliate, the areas flood, and this trash becomes soggy and buried and really difficult to remove, but still able to pollute this water and have all these negative environmental effects. So rather than having to constantly be responding to getting this trash out, there's a big virtue in trying to prevent it from occurring in the watershed in the first place. So the rest of the issue is that there are people living in these unsafe conditions, right? So these are a couple of encampments that we've had recently. The one in the center is actually an encampment that ended up having like 65,000 pounds of trash associated with that encampment. And there are about 30 people living in that area. We have areas where people build these elevated structures to attempt to get out of the floodway. And then unfortunately, this picture on the right is what happens when we see flooding. The river rises very quickly. Every winter, we see flooding issues that end up washing away encampments. And, usually people are able to get themselves out, but there are swiftwater rescues every year. And often they're not able to get all their belongings out. I've personally been in the riverbed multiple times where we've been helping people pack up as quickly as we can, and they have to leave things behind because they aren't able to pack up fast enough with the water rising. And that, it's just a super heartbreaking thing to happen when it's incredibly preventable to have people not living directly in harm's way. This is the data. I'm sorry, I included this stat again, but as I said, 74 to 95% of the total volume is linking trash to encampments. This is a word cloud we did just as an example of the most frequently occurring words in the data set of the data that we collect. And you can see in here, a lot of the things that we see are tents, blankets, clothing, tarps, things that are very associated with encampments. And I just thought this was a really kind of shocking thing. A lot of people think, oh, it's all, it's litter. It's like people throwing trash out their window of their car. And really the significant impact by volume is things related to encampments. And a lot of those things are these life-saving things that people have to have in order to live. But at the same time, when they get abandoned or escape, they become trash. This data set I wanted to just show because I think it helps to illustrate the impacts of things like this pandemic. So, if you look at this chart, as soon as the pandemic hit, we started to see these numbers go up. And we attribute that both to changes in policy and enforcement, but also the pandemic and the timeline for a lot of the protests that happened in 2020 that redirected police resources, changed what was happening in the riverbed as well. But it doesn't take very much for these numbers to spike. And I think it just illustrates that we have a very, very fragile policy solution so far to actually impacting the accumulation of trash in the riverbed. And then similarly, this is the number of encampments. You can see, especially in the city of San Diego, that number went up very, very rapidly at the beginning of the pandemic. I also like to stop here and say that the River Park Foundation historically has only tracked the number of encampments, not the number of people, because most of our volunteers we don't always know if people are home. It's not necessarily our goal to like make contact and connect with people while we're out doing our surveys. So we record the location of the encampments. We use the same multiplier that the Regional Task Force on the Homeless uses, which is 1.6, to kind of estimate the number of people associated with those encampments. So at our most recent survey, we estimate that there's about 200 people living along the main stem of the San Diego River. We don't currently survey a lot of the canyons and tributaries, although I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end of this presentation. So the number of people living in the watershed is actually probably larger than that, but that's our estimate for the main stem of the river. Of course, the trash itself really negatively impacts the populations of people living along the river, because there's a disease risk from pest vectors and bacteria. We hear all the time from people living in encampments that they have a lot of issues with rats and mosquitoes and things like that getting into their encampments, and that's just common in natural areas where there's water. We've also unfortunately been aware of people who've even died of MRSA and other bacterial issues in the riverbed. There's certainly injury at risk from these accumulations of trash when you're living amongst that. It's really dangerous to be living among all those hazardous materials. And it's very difficult in those situations to keep your food and other like important supplies separated from waste. So there's a lot of contamination issues. I think that this fourth bullet is something that it's hard for me to quantify, but I've certainly seen is the just sort of, you know, stigmatization by the public when they see encampments that have a lot of trash. It adds to the stigma against people living in who are experiencing homelessness, because they just are, you know, the answer may be that they have nowhere to take that trash, but at the same time, people who are housed have a harder time relating to people when they see them living in conditions like this. And as I said before, the camp and cooking fires getting out of control is really a serious risk. We are unfortunately aware of people who've been injured and died in fires as well. So it's the riverbed itself is not a very safe place to be. And I didn't write down the flooding. That's not necessarily related to the trash, but flooding risk is certainly a big issue as well. So the partnership that we have, we finally connected with PATH San Diego, which many of you may have already heard of. They're an organization that focuses on client management. They have housing units that they manage, as well as a lot of support services and outreach. So we worked with them to apply for a grant to fund hiring a riverbed outreach worker who would accompany our trash team. Our team would have the role of keeping up this database of where all the encampments are, changing our data collection protocols in the cases where we did encounter people, so that we could actually help PATH to get eyes on people that they may have lost track of, better understand where their clients are moving around to, without putting us in a position where our kind of like ecology background people have to have access to information that we probably shouldn't have access to about people's personal like medical histories and things like that. But we still can say like, hey, we saw so-and-so at this location, and we don't have to know any of his, any of the person's like personal information to be able to help with that role. We can also just be the safety buddy, so that the PATH doesn't have to have a team of 2. They can actually get started with just a team of 1. And then of course, we often will go out with that outreach worker. They've had a couple of different people working in that position, and like whenever they're first starting, they have no idea how to access the riverbed, where to go, and our team can help connect them with that. But then the actual service delivery, how they help find out what people actually have need for. Some of them are interested in shelter or housing right away, but oftentimes they have like more urgent needs that help develop trust and help connect people with the kind of the entry-level services. And over time, that can work toward housing navigation, getting people into something more permanent and more sustainable. PATH has also helped us when we see a flooding event on the horizon, they've helped us go out and do direct outreach to the people who are most immediately in harm's way to give them a heads up of what's coming and help prevent those like really critical emergencies that happen when the floodwaters rise really fast. So this has been a pretty small effort to start. We only have, as I said, one outreach worker who's going out, and their experience has been that each person can manage, 12, 15 clients probably easily, maybe up to 20, 25, but it depends on what the needs are of each client. And they certainly have a lot of people that they might have contacts with that are still kind of in they're not quite people that they're actively serving yet, but they're people they're sort of developing a little bit of help for. And, every time we go out with them, they're really great about helping provide those sort of like urgent needs, water, sanitation, things like that. So we have been, last year in 2020, Path and River Park Foundation volunteers were able to make 294 contacts. And a lot of those contacts really focused on getting PPE to people because of the pandemic. That was especially challenging. A lot of the places that people got their regular food and other support were interrupted by the pandemic. So I think this was really timely partnership. They were able to get, in 2020, 7 people placed into housing, and they had 31 new clients that kind of entered the process. And one thing that Path has told us is that by and large, the folks living in the riverbed many of them are not even in the system yet, because they just have been like living behind the scenes where people don't have access to them at all. And I think importantly, we have worked to really increase attention on this by media and elected officials and funders and everybody to try to say, hey, River Park Foundation and Path working together can really increase success in natural areas. San Diego is not the only place in California where we have encampments occurring in natural areas. This is happening all over the state, and there's tons of resources being deployed to remove trash. But I think that the bigger thing is, could those resources be better used in prevention? How can we use this partnership as sort of a case study to see what kind of prevention and impact we can have to lessen the need for cleanups, while at the same time connecting people with the services and housing that they might be able to, to connect with. I do want to make sure I talk about some of these challenges. Like, we don't have the code cracked or anything like that. I think the cons for us is that this is potentially really expensive to start up. If Path is managing 25 clients, like the number of people they will need to manage the 200 plus people living in the riverbed is quite a lot of staff time. But, again, that's something that we can start to evaluate the return on investment if we're able to do this data informed approach. There's a lot of confounding factors for this. In 2020, the pandemic, we saw changes in trash that were related to things like completely outside of the riverbed, like the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, or changes in statewide policy or something like that that changed. It makes it really difficult for us to have apples to apples data set. But I think that's one value of having both an environmental partner who's on top of those kind of things and a social partner who's on top of those issues. We can start to try to describe, mark up our data set to say, here's what happened here that influenced that. And again, we don't know right now if we're having an impact on other parts of the watershed. So if we're saying, okay, we want to really focus on the main stem of the riverbed, if there are some people who are tired of outreach workers bothering them, are they moving into a creek? I don't know yet, because we are not currently surveying in the creeks, but that's part of our expansion plan. That said, there's a lot of really good pros. One, this feels a lot more compassionate for our volunteers. Even environmental volunteers don't want to be part of anything that has to do with just chasing people around who are already vulnerable populations. Like, that's just a really unfun volunteer project, and it doesn't feel good to see people that are suffering and to contribute in any way to that suffering. So I think in that way, this is a really cool thing for an environment organization to be a part of. Always addressing the root cause of one of our most significant issues feels a lot more sustainable than just constantly addressing the symptoms of the problem. I think by tapping into water quality, the social work, and the environment side, we can potentially leverage a lot more investment in this issue so that we're not trying to solve each of those issues independently in silos. And I think also this partnership is a way for us to collaborate without hiring a social worker ourselves, for example. Initially there were some River Park Foundation supporters who were kind of like, why are you doing this? Like, what does this have to do with your mission? And I think by us focusing on the data and the river and then partnering to share that data for good, I think we can have a win-win scenario. And then of course, the last thing is we've leaned on PATH a lot to help us understand privacy concerns and make sure that the data that we collect is appropriately public. So we really believe in sharing data sets and trying to have other people have access to our data, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not accidentally leaving anybody vulnerable to having their private information shared in a public portal. So we've definitely had an eye on that this entire last 4 years while we've been developing this partnership. And then lastly, we are working on increasing this partnership. The San Diego Water Quality Control Board has an investigative order out now that is ordering everybody, all the municipalities that allow discharge of stormwater into the San Diego River, to identify the sources of fecal contamination in the riverbed, in the San Diego River water. And that, you know, could be from old leaky infrastructure, septic tanks and sewer spills and things like that from people who are housed, as well as it could have contributions from encampments. And this order is requiring quantifying those different contributions. So likely the encampments is a probably small contributor, but this order will be the first in the state that actually quantifies that that contribution. So we are working with PATH to do quite a bit of surveys, census information, and other things that will help inform developing this actual quantification of fecal coliform and other bacterial contributions from people experiencing homelessness. So I think for us, I can see why people want to live here, right? This isn't just a photo of how pretty it is in the riverbed. You know, these folks have a view of the water. Like, these are not unlike campgrounds that all of us might pay for to go hang out in. So I think part of what we are really excited about the opportunity to do is say, you know, these areas are beautiful. They should be open to everyone, but there are limits to the negative impact that is appropriate to the river, and they are not areas that are appropriate for year-round habitation. So we were hoping that through this partnership, we can have something that's a win-win, where we both help connect people who are vulnerable to some of the threats that I talked about and protect the environment at the same time. So what I'm hoping is that some of you guys will be so excited and want to come join us for a couple of volunteer opportunities. October 2nd and 3rd, just coming up this weekend, and next weekend, the 9th and 10th, is California Clean Air Day. And Clean Air Day is actually funding a little bit of this work, but we're hoping to go out and do a comprehensive data collection. So, you know, the slide I showed at the beginning that had all the October numbers, it's that time of year where we do our October count. We'll be walking the entire riverbed from Santee to the ocean on foot in teams to update all of our data in one go. That helps us understand how the trends are changing in the riverbed, both by location and source. So it's both geospatial and cumulative that we use that data. So I hope that you guys might consider coming out for those events, especially if you're more interested in the environment side, just because this is a chance to see some sections of the riverbed that are spectacularly pretty and nobody ever gets to go to because they're either on private property or they're not accessible in some way. In addition, we have our point in time count. which is, some of you guys may have already heard or volunteered for We All Count, which is a survey that the Regional Task Force on the Homeless organizes every January. And that data is used to submit to the federal government to help allocate some of the resources that are available through the Housing and Urban Development Department of the federal government. They're required to do a census, both of sheltered and unsheltered people. And River Park Foundation has been leading the Riverbed portion of that count since 2013. So that's coming up in January, but more immediately, we're looking to start expanding that census to do it quarterly, especially because the Riverbed has so much seasonal variation. I think it's going to be really important for us to do that. So the November count is just organized by us. It's not part of the Regional Task Force's data collection, although we will be sharing the information. But that one is another one where I think it would be really awesome. And I know it overlaps with the Homelessness Action Week at USD. So it's a great way to kind of take your interest in this issue and turn it into action. It's going to be an early morning. We get started early before people start moving around from their encampments because we don't want to duplicate counts. So it's, again, really fun, and it's all with teams and guided leaders. So if you're nervous about exploring the riverbed in the dark, don't be, because it'll be right at dawn and it will be with people who know what they're doing. So yeah, we hope you'll come out to one of those events. I know that you have a sign up that USD is organizing, but you can also get more information by emailing volunteer@sandiegoriver.org. So that's it. I'm ready for questions. I can stop sharing so that I can actually see. Is that good? If I just send this out, you guys can have my contact information. I don't have to leave it up long enough to.
That's perfect.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, then.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My goodness. I learned a ton, and that was so interesting. Yeah, we have a lot of great questions, Sarah, and we only have time for maybe one or two. We'll see. I just really wanted to stress to everyone on the call here or in the Zoom room that, yeah, we are partnering on the river census and the river cleanup. So please, we really need you to volunteer for that. Tell your friends and organizations to volunteer. Not just because it's a good cause, but it's just a really good experience for all of us to have. So thank you, Sarah, for helping us collaborate with you on that. That's going to be amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm just pulled up the questions. I can see these and I can kind of run through, but I also, if you guys want anything we don't get to, I'll just add some comments in the collaborative document afterward, if that would be helpful.
That is great. I don't know. You would have to be like, it would be a record if you could answer all those questions in 9 minutes. But there's some in there, Sarah, as you can see that there's some asterisks by them. And so maybe let me just start with the one I see with the most asterisks, and then you're free to answer any ones that you have time for, if that's okay.
Great.
It's a wonderful partnership you described with PATH. And I think one of the questions is about, is there what does the collaboration look like with the San Diego Police Department or other law enforcement agencies that you have, so they can kind of see the push-pull and they can kind of see the same data you're seeing?
Yeah, so we already collaborate with, as I said, there's a lot of different stakeholders. So we work with the SDPD and in Santee with the Sheriff's Department. They have access to the locations of encampments. There are a lot of rules and case law that govern how enforcement happens on public land. There's the Boise decision kind of gives some guidance about what kind of enforcement is allowed when there are alternatives to living unhoused in the riverbed or in natural areas on public lands and things like that. But on private property, those decisions don't apply. So a lot of private property owners, they do need help from enforcement when they say that we're not going to allow this encampment to be on our property. And that has been the case for a long time, that prior to a cleanup, a landowner or whoever is the organization doing the cleanup would engage SDPD to notify people that they couldn't stay where they're staying and to, if needed, follow up and in some cases arrest or move people if they weren't, or cite them usually, not arrest them most of the time. But that's part of what motivated us to get more involved in how can we have a more sustainable option so that people who were living in these natural areas because they didn't have anywhere else to go had an alternative that was something better than a police officer driving them to a shelter or something like that. I personally have met a lot of SDPD officers who work in the riverbed who are pretty compassionate, like cool people, but at the same time, a lot of people have a lot of trauma associated with their history of interactions with the police. And honestly, even if sometimes they have the right message, it's the wrong messenger. So we've really tried to make sure that there's more options for people to take advantage of alternatives to just city-run shelters. But ultimately, especially on private property, people aren't allowed to trespass and camp on private property. And even on private land, as I said, some of it's really not a safe place to stay. So I think it's kind of one of those things that it shouldn't be the only tool in the toolbox, but I think as long as there are multiple tools in that toolbox, that's sort of been our approach, is let's try to make sure that we provide alternatives as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. That helps a lot.
The other partner I didn't mention is code enforcement, because sometimes that's another entity that gets involved when it's on private property. So sometimes landowners are, being told that they're in violation of some trash ordinances. So that, their hands are kind of tied. Everybody, I think, wants to try to do the right thing, at least by and large in these areas, but it's difficult if you don't have information about what those tools are.
Right. And you just were mentioning, I think something that relates to another question, just about the stories that you may have heard from those experiencing homelessness in the riverbed.
Yeah.
And then also, that's not in the question, this one's just mine, but do you collect the demographic data? Like, do we know, are there families? Are there more Black San Diegans than white San Diegans? Like, how does the demographics match with what we know the demographics are of homelessness more broadly?
That's a great question. So I'll answer that one first because it's a little bit shorter of an answer. That we don't collect demographic information except through the We All Count, because there are questions in that survey that refer to that, but we don't keep that data. Part of this gets to what I was talking about, we don't want to be in a position where we have access to sensitive information just because the people that we hire and the people that we recruit as volunteers primarily have an ecology or biology or sort of water science background. And we want to be careful about having access to information that we may inadvertently, share. So one of the things that's cool about PATH is that they collect all kinds of information and they have the appropriate training to have that information. And they use the county's, system for getting information collected so that it's accessible to other outreach workers as well. So we're in the beginning stages of being able to answer a question a little bit about like how the riverbed population differs from the homeless and unsheltered population at large in San Diego. But what I have now is mostly anecdotal, which is we see mostly adults. There are occasionally families, but it is uncommon that there are families that are staying in the riverbed for very long. There are some people who are living in vehicles along the river, and in some cases, those might have family units that I don't have as much information on because we mostly focus on like naturalized areas. We see, I think the thing that I've come to learn is that there's just no one story. Everybody comes from all kinds of different backgrounds. There's people who've had medical problems that have resulted in their homelessness. There's people who have had deaths in their family that have resulted in their homelessness. There's people who have mental health and addiction issues that have contributed. There's just really no one type of person. I've seen people of every gender and background and, ethnicity. I think some of the stories that we see that really have motivated us to get involved. I spent the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, right before the pandemic, helping a couple move out of the riverbed who the guy had COPD and was using a generator run oxygen machine to live, and that was running in the riverbed, and there was a big storm coming and they were going to get flooded and he wasn't very mobile. So, you know, that's one of those examples where 2 or 3 of my staff plus PATH plus the PD, everybody was there trying to get folks connected, and that's a huge use of resources because it was an emergency intervention instead of some sort of like long-term investment in getting people to safety. Thankfully, those folks, as a result of that, have been housed since that day, which is really cool. Those kind of successes. I actually was out yesterday with a volunteer of ours who got involved with us because her son was experiencing homelessness in the riverbed and she had lost track of him. And she connected with us so that she could hopefully spend some time in the riverbed trying to find him. And it took about 5 months, but we did run into him. And so they are reconnected. He's living with his girlfriend and their children in an apartment. But, you know, all of those stories are one of those things where it's not as simple as like finding somebody, offering the right services and like, yeah, Yahoo, we're done. We did it. They're not homeless anymore. You know, it's an ongoing investment. In the first case, it was by multiple agencies. The second case was by his mom, really, you know, but I think it just shows that even people who are in like some of the most dire circumstances where it's really hard to imagine them going from the condition you find them to paying rent in an apartment or, you know, whatever, it's possible. And that's what we hope. Every time we find an encampment that is no longer active, we hope that's what happened. But the reality is without some investment of these resources, that's just not what happens.
Yeah.
Let's see, I see another couple of starred ones. I do want to answer that question number 1. We don't pick up anything from active encampments. So all of our teams go out and they have to have a lot of training about how to document what is active and what is not active. Active doesn't just mean like someone is home. It means that there's evidence that someone is coming back. So that might be that there are items of value. It might mean that there's things that have been like tidied up, for like a bedroll that's been tidied up. If we can't tell, we call it active until we're sure it's inactive. We're in the riverbed a lot, so that helps us say, like, we've been here 4 or 5 times, nothing has changed over the last month. We're comfortable calling this inactive. Or if something gets buried in vegetation or spider webs or something like that, it's easy to tell people haven't been there. But we don't pick up anything that's related to an active encampment, with the exception of when someone is home and tells us, this is my trash, like, it would be great if you could haul it for me. But that's just a hard line for our team, because we don't ever want to be accidentally taking something of value. And our volunteers are not necessarily able to tell what is of value to somebody who's living in the riverbed. Like, we don't want to be making those kind of judgment calls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we're at time. I can't believe that we're at time, but thank you so much. I mean, this is, we've done quite a few of these, Sarah, and you wouldn't know that the questions that your presentation sparked were really, really meaningful. And I think it just goes to the work that you're doing. And again, thank you for sharing your time with us. Thank you for collaborating with us this semester. And I hope that we can all see each other in person at the River Census or this weekend.